So with that, we know when we might want to use useReducer. How does it work though? It looks like this, and that's quite a bit of code. So let's have a look at this step by step. useReducer, just like useState, always returns an array with exactly 2 values, and therefore you can use array destructuring, as we did it with useState, to pull out these values and store them in separate constants. Now the 2 values you're getting are the latest state snapshot, because it is a state management mechanism like useState, so of course you get your state snapshot. But you also get a function that allows you to update that state snapshot. So that's kind of the same as for useState, though the state updating function will work differently. Instead of just setting a new state value, you will dispatch an action. And that action will be consumed by the first argument you pass to useReducer, a so-called reducer function. So this is a function which gets the latest state snapshot automatically, because this function will be called by React, and it gets the action that was dispatched, because React will call this reducer function whenever a new action is dispatched. So then it gets the last state snapshot managed by React, and it gets the action that was dispatched that triggered this reducer function execution. Now, the reducer function then also should do one important thing. It should return a new updated state. So it's a bit like the function form of the useState hook, but an extended version of that, you could say, because of that action thing, which you'll see in action, no pun intended, in a second. In addition, you can also set some initial state and also an initial function that should run to set the initial state in case your initial state is a bit more complex and, for example, the result of, let's say, a HTTP request or anything like that. We'll ignore that for now. So that's useReducer in theory. Let's see it in action. Now, I did mention that we could use useReducer here to combine our entered values and validities for the email and the password, and that we could also use it to manage the overall form state with it. So we could either manage one big form state that includes everything or multiple smaller states. Both would work, both would be fine, but to keep things simple here, we will simply start by managing our email state with useReducer. And there the goal is to combine the value and the validity into one state managed by useReducer. First of all, we need to import useReducer here. And we then call it, for example, here. And useReducer, as you learned, returns an array with exactly 2 elements, and we can use array destructuring to pull those elements out of it. Now, I'm going to use reducer for my email and my password separately. You could also merge this all into one big reducer. And here we therefore get back, let's say, the email state and our dispatch function. I'll name it dispatch email. These names are up to you, of course. Then I mentioned that useReducer as a first argument takes a function. Here again, I'm using an anonymous function, though we actually could also outsource this into a separate named function, maybe to make this easier to read. And I'll name this email reducer, and I'll store my function, my arrow function, in this constant so that I can point at email reducer here. Now please note that I created this reducer function outside of the component function. And I did so because inside of this reducer function, we won't need any data that's generated inside of the component function. So this reducer function can be created outside of the scope of this component function because it doesn't need to interact with anything defined inside of the component function. All the data which will be required and used inside of the reducer function will be passed into this function when it's executed by React automatically. So that's why we can define it outside of the component function here. Now this reducer function receives 2 arguments, 2 parameters. Our last state snapshot and the action that was dispatched. And you'll see what this action is in just a second. And we should return a new state. Now here our state could be an object where we have the value, which is initially an empty string, and let's say the isValid field, which initially is false, for example. That also could be our initial state here, which is the second argument we pass to useReducer. Value and isValid to false. That's the initial state we set here for our email state snapshot. Now the email state is therefore what we can use in our code. For example here, where I want the entered email. Now that's email state.value, because that's where we're going to store the entered value. We don't have the code for that yet, but soon we will. So that's where we could access this. Also here, email state.value includes at. But actually keep in mind that we have the isValid field in there. And we're going to add code that changes it eventually soon. So instead of revalidating here, we could also just check if email state isValid is true. And therefore we can simplify this here. Email state is valid. And if we scroll down further here in the submit handler, here we want to forward the value. So that would be email state.value. And in the JSX code, of course, instead of email is valid, we have email state is valid. And here, where I pass the value back into the input, we have email state.value. And that should be the different places where I'm using my email states. With that, entered email and email is valid should now be gray because we're not using them anywhere in our code anymore. So we can remove these two use state calls here, and I will comment them out so that we still see this alternative, but we're not using it anymore. But we're not done with the reducer. Right now, it always returns this state, which of course is not what we want. Instead, we need to dispatch an action eventually. We need to dispatch it here, for example, when we want to update the value, or here when we want to update the validity. Now let's start with the value. Here we now update this by calling dispatch email, and we pass to it a so-called action. Now it's totally up to you what this action is. It can be a string identifier, something like new email value. It could be a number, but often it will be an object which has some field that holds some identifier. Often the field is then named type, and that could be something like user input, for example. Now it doesn't have to be all caps, that's just a convention you see a lot. So a string all caps with some clearly understandable identifier. And then we also can add an extra payload to this action. Again, I'm saying you can because it's up to you. But here, since we want to save what the user entered, we of course, it would make sense to add some payload. So for example, a val field that holds the event target value. So now that's our action. It's this object with a type field that describes what happened and extra payload, in this case, the value the user entered. So this now will trigger this function here to execute because that's the reducer function we passed to useReducer. Now here we can handle this action, for example, with an if statement. We can check if action.type is equal to user input. Keep in mind, what we dispatch as an action will be an object because that's what we set it to here. And this object happens to have a type field, so I can check for action.type here and check if the value stored in that type field is that string with the content user input. And if that's the case, we could say, now then I don't want to return this empty state snapshot. Instead, I want to return a state snapshot for my email where the value is action.val. That's the payload we appended to our action. And maybe we also want to update the validity here if we're already at it. Simply by, for example, checking if action valid, and then the same logic as down there, includes the @ symbol for this very trivial validation. So here I'm then updating both the value and is valid whenever I receive this user input action. And for any other action that might reach this reducer, this default state will be returned. Now, we also need to dispatch an action here on the validate email handler. So instead of setting the email as valid here, I can dispatch email again pass in an object. You should be consistent. Your actions should always have the same structure so that your code where you, for example, try to access a type property does not suddenly fail. So once you decided for an action structure, you want to stick to it. Therefore, here I again dispatch an object with a type field. Now here it's, for example, input blur, because the input lost focus, it was blurred. And we don't need to add a value here necessarily, because all we care about here is that the input lost focus. There is no extra data that needs to be added. So here we have a simpler action, so still an object, still with a type property, but without a value. The fact that the val is missing does not matter, because this line here, where we try to access the value, will not run for action of type input blur, because we only run this if the action type is user input. Instead, I will check if the action type is input blur, and if it is, I want to return a new snapshot, a new state value for my email state. But now the value, of course, should be the value we had before. I don't want to reset this to be empty because the input could blur after the user entered something. I don't want to lose that. So therefore, I'll use my last state snapshot, which I get here. And this is guaranteed to be the absolute last state snapshot. React gives us this state snapshot and it makes sure that it's the latest one. So here we can safely access state.value, for example, to access the last value that was entered for the email. And for the validity, we can therefore check if state value is valid by again repeating our validity check here. And of course, you could also refactor this check into a function, but I don't want to make this overly complicated. So with this, we now have this extra action. And as a result, if I log out here, you see initially it's blurred, which makes sense actually, because my initial value for is valid is false. If I set this to undefined or to null instead, you'll see it's not treated as invalid. It's not treated as if it was blurred from the beginning on. But if I click in there, it is. And if I then start typing, I'm getting an error. Cannot read property includes of undefined. And what could be causing that? Well, it looks like we're having problems running this code here, because that clearly has to be the action that triggered. And that's simply because here I'm checking action valid. Of course, that should be action val. So the value I'm retrieving here. So a simple typo here, my mistake. Let's reload. Now I can type here, and that all seems to work. And overall, this works as before. Without the debouncing, because I commented out that code, but the general form validation works. Now with the help of useReducer. And this allows us to group this email state together and manage it in one place. It's a little bit more setup up here, but on the other hand, the code in the component then is simpler, because there we only need to dispatch and not do any validation or anything like that. So here's a task for you now. Take this, attach to find the finished code snapshot, and do the same for the password.